Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Today we have another special episode with two guests. We'll be talking about the death of Lady Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed in 1997 in Paris. And I have two very special guests, Mark Zaid, who's an attorney mostly involved with government transparency, and he also represented the father of one of the victims, Mohamed Al-Fayed. And I also have the pleasure of having with me investigative journalist Gerald Posner, who's one of the first ones to say who found some mistakes in the initial investigations and also had a role in finding things that the police would have not discovered otherwise, probably. Thanks for your time, guys, and thanks for being with me for the third time on this channel.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's
Great.
a pleasure always.
Is there anything else before we get into the main topic of this conversation that you feel is relevant? Adding about yourselves, guys, that maybe I skipped in the introduction, whatever you feel is also important for my viewers to know.
Well, I guess I can start, and I think actually, Gerald, you can remind me when did your article that we're of course going to be discussing come out? I'm trying to remember if it predated me or not.
Coming on the second anniversary, just before the second anniversary of her death in '99.
Okay, so Gerald's article came out before my formal involvement in this case, but they both very much tie together because I used Gerald's article to push my legal efforts. So I represented Mohamed Al-Fayed and Harrods department store, which he owned at the time, from 2000 to 2003. So I was the lead American lawyer who was handling the investigation into Princess Diana's death. And all sorts of allegations, and we engaged in litigation in the United States, in the District of Columbia, our capital city, under the Freedom of Information Act. And there was also a defamation case that was ongoing in California that I can talk about because that goes to all these different conspiracy theories, of which the primary one was that, of course, the royal family, the late King Philip, murdered Princess Diana, and whomever else happened to be in the car. Two other people in the car who died, one a bodyguard who was injured seriously, and that the Israelis might have been involved, the American CIA might have been involved, and all sorts of other intelligence issues of different countries, including in Paris, France, where, of course, the incident happened. And in pushing forward on the litigation that I was handling, which also involved dealing with the U.S. government and some former MI6 spies as well, Richard Tomlinson, who we can talk about. I very much used, and I'll kick this off to Gerald to explain how he got involved. I very much used a lot of the questions that Gerald identified in his article to demand answers to those particular mysteries that existed from the death in August of 1997.
Yeah, and the great thing about, Mark's effort and what I was doing as a reporter is they were parallel in some ways, but completely separate from each other. So he didn't know that I was working on doing this piece and off for months on chasing the story down. I didn't know until he actually got in touch with me that he was representing later Mohamed Al-Fayed and Harrods and filing lawsuits to get documents released from the NSA and a whole bunch of other things. So that my involvement came around when Tina Brown, who had been the sort of celebrated editor of Vanity Fair and then the New Yorker, and I had done some work for her when she was at the New Yorker, decided to launch a new magazine called Talk magazine with the Weinstein brothers, believe it or not, at a time before the Weinstein brothers were notorious. And Talk was going to have its premiere issue in the summer of '99. Tina, who was British, had some suspicions about Diana's death, believe it or not, and thought that a great article for the premiere issue of her new magazine would be having me find evidence that there was foul play in the murder of the princess. And I remember when she called me and said, I'm going to give you several months to go ahead and do this. You're going to be able to travel, report, do everything, find it. And I sort of said, I'm the person who in the Kennedy assassination thinks that it's a lone assassin. I may not be the right person. I'm naturally skeptical about the ideas of these grand conspiracies. And that's why she was great at marketing. She said, "You're the perfect person to do it because if you find something, everyone will believe it. So go off and do it." She was crestfallen when I came back a few months later after having been to France and going to the UK, talking to Mohamed Al-Fayed, doing the interviews, getting some intelligence information, that although I did think it was a car accident, in the end, it's not surprising. It won't surprise you, Leonardo. Certainly won't surprise Mark, who looks at this all the time, that in even complex accident cases or ones that are put under a microscope, you find a lot of problems sometimes with the police investigation, with what was done in terms of the autopsy. There are mistakes made. But as I said when I turned in my piece to her, although I haven't found the evidence of a murder plot, I found plenty of things that will give conspiracy theorists around the case plenty to think about, including the fact that I heard a snippet of a tape. There were two things. I had seen pictures of Diana that were offered to me and to Talk Magazine for, at that time, for $2 million, taken before any of the emergency services had arrived. And the princess is in the back seat. Her head's rolled a little bit to the back. She doesn't have any visible blood or scarring on her. And her eyes are somewhat closed, almost as though she's trying to keep away from the flashlights that are taking place. We obviously didn't buy them. They were later sold, and they did surface about 6 months later, a series of pictures of that. The police didn't even settle off the area for nearly an hour. It was part of the problem. Tourists were there. There were people wandering by, picking up bits of souvenirs. 10 of the paparazzi got away without ever being held accountable. So there were all types of problems. But I also listened to a snippet of a tape recording that at that time, 2 American intelligence assets, one played for me what was supposedly, I heard a British woman together with a woman with a slight Hispanic accent, and that was told to me to be part of conversations that the National Security Agency had picked up with Princess Diana and her friend Luisa Flecha Lima, the wife of the Brazilian ambassador in Washington, D.C., inadvertently as part of an investigation they were otherwise doing. That material became explosive on its own, even though it didn't have anything to do with the murder of Princess Di. And that's some of what Mark then went after with the NSA files.
Well, guys, I think that even before we get into the dynamics of this car crash, I think that we need to understand to focus on the most important person of this case, who's not Lady Diana, but Henri Paul, the driver. The driver who was driving too fast. Probably this is exactly the case of the car crash. It was going too fast in the tunnel. Who is this guy? Can we first off assess who this person is? Because I understand that he had a lot of money with him, that he had multiple bank accounts, that he was connected with French intelligence. Can we assess who this person is even before we get into what happened?
And I'll let because I'll let Gerald dive into some of it, but what I'll introduce that part by saying this aspect of it, the Henri Paul role, very much it can be likened to the Kennedy assassination, in that as you start looking at people and you look at who their connections might be, you start stumbling upon things that might not have anything to do with anything else. So Henri Paul may very well have had connections to a number of intelligence agencies and others, but it has nothing to do with the tragic accident that he befell himself, since he died as a result also. And I'll let Gerald dive down to it further and then swing back in.
Yeah, I think what Mark says is very interesting. People assume that there are people either who believe in coincidence or they never believe in coincidence. I do believe sometimes in coincidence, and I understand that, and that definitely applies with the case of Henri Paul. So Henri Paul here he is a chauffeur. He is not a security person, but he's the person who's driving Dodi that night toward the apartment that Dodi has not far from the Ritz Hotel, when Diana and Dodi decide to leave the hotel and they're going to go to Dodi's apartment. He's the one who is driving the car, we now say, too fast, because he lost control of it when the paparazzi are chasing him and he goes into the Pont a Matano. If he had been able to make that turn, not hit into the concrete barrier, and had escaped from the paparazzi or stayed ahead of them until he got to Dodi's apartment, wouldn't have been too fast, but it was right at that line. He lost control of it. Later, we find out that, as Mark said, it's not surprising that somebody in a position like him, who is often at the Ritz Hotel, where there are dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, people from other countries, CEOs of companies staying, that it might be on what I call, he might be an asset to French domestic intelligence. They might be picking up information by keeping him on the hook to find out what's going on. And I had two American intelligence assets that told me they had seen the information that Henri Paul met with one of his French security handlers earlier in the evening, when the French investigation couldn't determine what he was doing, before he drove Dodi and Diana on that fateful ride, with his security handler, who gave him some money. When the crash took place that night, he's found with about 12,500 francs, so like $2,400 in his pocket. Some of that was actually given to him that night. They did not talk about Diana. They didn't talk about Dodi. They talked about other materials, as I understand it. But still, that's enough to feed conspiracy theories that Henri Paul is meeting with French security officers the evening and is handed money before the accident happens. One other thing about him. Later, his legal limit is shown, and Mark might remember the exact amount. I think it's 2.5 to 3 times what was the limit in France. There were problems that I picked up in the autopsy. For instance, his body wasn't put into a cooler for several hours. Okay, that's a mistake that happens, but it could lead to contamination. The blood samples that were taken from him were not refrigerated for several hours. Now, I talked to Michael Bodden, who Mark knows very well, who is a forensic pathologist who had done thousands of accident autopsies in New York City when he was the medical examiner. And he said if you used, and he gave me a list of certain preservatives in those blood samples you drew out, it wouldn't matter, even in the middle of summer in Paris, that they weren't refrigerated. But the French would never respond, nor have they responded to this day, to indicate whether those preservatives were in the blood or not. So they leave the opening for the idea that Dodi, that Mohamed Al-Fayed later had, which is the blood was planted. It wasn't really Henri Paul's blood in the first place. They somehow were able to get it in. That's why it has a high level. The entire thing was concocted. It's made to look like that. He wasn't really drunk. In the end, I'm convinced that he was, in fact, over the legal limit, that he was somebody who had these intelligence contacts. They weren't major, that he had met with one of his handlers that evening and had some cash in his pocket, maybe not all of the cash he had, but he was definitely driving too fast, and the alcohol probably was the impairment that let him lose control.
Yeah, and part of that,
sorry,
his carbon monoxide level was at a line that if that was present in some normal person's body, they probably would be asleep or something, that they'd be very drowsy. But it wasn't a normal level, and there was some suspicion at first. Well, could that be from the airbag, the steering wheel airbag, as it exploded? Could that exude carbon monoxide? Because I think there is some carbon monoxide level in there, but whatever it was, no, it could not. That was not enough. So either it wasn't his blood sample, or it was contaminated as a blood sample, or there was a mistest. I mean, there's lots of different explanations, and people should understand. So Mohamed Al-Fayed owned the Ritz. He had for a number of years, and this was, since he was Egyptian born, but now in England, was the place for, the hierarchy of the Middle Eastern community to go to. And it's the Ritz. So, there's tons of powerful people, rich and political, who are going to this hotel. So it was a vast target for probably multiple intelligence agencies of many countries because of who was staying there. So the premise is that Henri Paul, who was the acting security manager for the hotel, but more of a driver for Al-Fayed, was a source, an asset to all these agencies. Not about the princess. I mean, if he had been caught doing that by Al-Fayed, that would have been the end of his career. He would have been fired immediately. And obviously, why is Al-Fayed involved? The princess is dating his son, Dodi Al-Fayed. There's lots of different stories about how serious it was, but, suppose they were having a good time together. Let's just put it, I guess, at that, at a minimum. And Henri Paul was making something, if I remember correctly, I'm thinking back, so many years, think he was making like $36,000 a year equivalent US dollars. So the amount of money that he had in his pocket was like 10%, 15% of his annual salary that he had in cash. So that obviously was something unusual. I guess it's similar to Kristi Noem, our Secretary of Homeland Security, who had her purse stolen recently and had $3,000 of cash in her purse for some strange reason. I'm sure there's an interesting explanation for that too. But that's the theory, at least with Henri Paul. And he had been called back to work, which is why the suspicion is that he had alcohol in his system, because he had gone off for the evening. Although, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gerald, I don't think anyone had any eyewitness evidence that I can recall of seeing him drinking.
No. As a matter of fact, they did not, Mark. And the interesting thing is nobody then reported that he was stumbling around, that he was a fall down drunk, that he was walking into walls. He was clearly, he was somebody who was able to hold his alcohol. He functioned, right? We've all dealt with sometimes, I've had people that I've done business with or known for years or whatever else, and later they turned themselves into an alcohol treatment program. And I was sort of stunned because I didn't know they were functioning alcoholics. They worked every day and performed and did everything great and never showed a sign that they were drinkers. So you can't always tell. But one thing that you said, I think that's important, is people who aren't familiar with the case of Diana's death might not also realize why there is an understandable motive here from the perspective of Mohamed Fayed. And that is, it's not just a grieving father who is saying, "Oh, I happen to think that my son was killed by the British royals." You have to view it from his perspective, and I think I got that, and you clearly must have as his attorney. When I was interviewing him, he felt as though in the UK, even though he owned Harrods, this crown jewel of retail, and there was at that time a Jewish businessman, Green, who owned Arcadia Group, which owned Topshop and others, sort of a lower end but big British retailer. Fayed was of the view that if you were not part of the club, the sort of that aristocratic end of British society, you were Jewish or Muslim or whatever else, you owned one of their big retail outlets, you were just a shopkeeper. You might own Harrods, but in the view of those people who owned, were really the old British, old line blue bloods, they looked down on you. And the fact that the mother of the future king of England, and that's what Diana was, would be in a breakup, having left Charles, now dating, whether, as you said, Mark, serious or not, she's dating a Muslim man who is a playboy, in many respects. And the idea that the future king of England could have a Muslim stepfather, had everybody's hair on fire. So just like in the JFK assassination, where people who think it's a conspiracy often say about Kennedy, by the way, if Kennedy had lived, everything would have been perfect. He would have got us out of Vietnam. He would have done everything right, made none of the mistakes of Johnson. In the view of Mohamed Al-Fayed and everything else, it was on the way to marriage. She was just on the verge of being pregnant if she wasn't already. There was going to be a Muslim stepbrother or stepsister of the future king of England. No wonder the Brits stepped in when they did. So that's sort of the grand motive behind it.
Well, but what do you think is the biggest role in the car crash? Was it the speed? Was it the paparazzi? Was it the alcohol to a certain level, or a combination of the three things?
I'm sure it was a combination, and the added factor and sort of the question that still is out there. Again, very similar to the Kennedy assassination, where you can look at the case now, still believe single bullet, one gunman, but you can identify some questions that still linger 60. What are we at? 62 years later. Like, who was behind the grassy knoll fence that a police officer encountered, who were in suits that said they were Treasury Department or Secret Service agents, as one allegation goes, right? I don't know if we have answers to it potentially, but that's an open question. There are open questions. Same thing with Princess Diana's death. There was evidence that the car that Henri Paul was driving with the princess impacted another vehicle, a white Fiat Uno, which is a fairly common French car, I think, as I recall.
Italian
There
car.
was paint or
Italian, a
European
very famous Italian car.
Italian car. Sorry, no offense, no offense.
No
That
worries.
someone's driving in Paris. There was paint that they matched to it. Obviously, no white Fiat Uno had ever been recovered, although there was a paparazzi whose white Fiat Uno was found embroiled in flames, and he was dead. He was potentially murdered / suicide. I think that's one of the weird open stories and questions that still relate to this particular case. He took apparently hundreds of photos, and his studio was broken into, and nothing was ever recovered. I've never heard really good explanations for it, but I've never also really heard any direct connections to it. So who knows what it was, but that car has never been found. So I think the working theory is that as Henri Paul was speeding, I believe, if I recall, 120 miles an hour, something like that, going through the Alma Tunnel, which of course all the cameras, as Gerald reported in his article, were not working for some reason. Ooh, conspiracy mystery. And he might have clipped this other car, maybe trying to go around it. I mean, obviously, the conspiracy theory would be it tried to block him, and it was a hit job. And we can talk about Richard Tomlinson and the Yugoslavian theory, because that was a very I'm not saying violent. That was a very prominent theory that we were looking at because there was stated evidence of it, nothing that ever materialized, but we can talk details. But somehow it clipped this car, either accidentally or deliberately, and that sent it spinning, and it crashed into one of the cement stanchions, whatever one calls it, holding up the tunnel, or it's separating the two sides of the tunnel, if I remember correctly. And and the sad part, of course, is 3 out of 4 people died. They died for a reason. They didn't have their seatbelts on. The one survivor had his seatbelt on.
That's right. And if British Protective Services had been there, it's very likely they would have strapped Diana into a seatbelt, but that's a separate item. But when you mention the Fiat, it's a combination. Mark's absolutely right. It's speed, no question. And then it does clip this Fiat Uno. And the reason we say that is at the scene outside of the Pont Alma tunnel, about 40 meters outside, is a part of a taillight and part of a bumper that actually matched a Fiat Uno. So that police know that it might be a slow-moving Fiat on the right lane, 2-lane road. Comes this Mercedes at high speed, followed by literally over a dozen of the paparazzi on bikes at high speed. Some of them trying to get up to the car to take a picture of them inside. Those are the pictures that are worth a lot of money to the tabloids, the French paparazzi. I met with them. I met with nearly 9 of them. Let me tell you, they are cold-blooded. They thought of themselves as victims. They didn't think, they thought all he had to do, they literally said, all he, meaning Dodi, had to do was give us a picture. He knew we wanted a picture. This is our business. They could have come out and given us a picture, but instead they made the value of the picture a greater one by trying to get away, by actually leaving without us getting the picture. So therefore, of course, we're chasing them because that's our livelihood. He knows the game and he's to blame. I love how they switch it around completely. They felt no remorse at all. But that Uno, by the way, I do think the French authorities, I saw part of the French police file, which still has not been released in full. And in that French police file, not only did they have a picture of a Fiat Uno that had Bondo on it, sort of a compound, the next day in the area where they think it might have been hit, but it had been painted with a red primer by a person whose brother worked in an auto shop. And the owner of that, although the French officially have never charged him or said it's him, is a young Vietnamese Le Van Tan, who lives about 3 miles away from where the accident took place and had an alibi that night that he was at work, although none of his coworkers actually remember him being at work, but that's a different issue. For whatever reason, they've never identified that Uno. And Mark's right, it's one of the lingering mysteries. Fayed believed, he told me, Mohamed Fayed, that the Uno was actually a specially provided car. He may have said this to you, Mark, that was done as a combination. I think a CIA provided Uno sort of in a factory that MI6 then took. And so it was specially rigged and ready to go. And then it had a flash of light as well, which blinded the driver and sent him careening into the concrete pillar. But I think that there was a car involved that night as part of an accident. And look, Mark's right. Not only do 3 of the people die, 1 lives, but I'm not a doctor, but there's little doubt from speaking to doctors about Diana that she could have lived. It wasn't intentional that the French emergency services dealt with her like that, but they took 2 hours to get her to the hospital for treatment. They have a process where they believe that you stabilize the patient at the scene, as opposed to the Americans who rush in and do scoop and run. We rush in and stabilize them as fast as we can, put them on a helicopter and the ambulance, and they're off to the ER. Here, you stabilize them at the scene and then take them to the hospital. She turns out that although she looks good, her breathing's a little labored. She has a small tear on her left pulmonary vein, and her cavity is slowly filling with blood. So the only thing that could be bad for her is sort of time, and that's what happened in this case.
Well, an explanation I heard on an Italian documentary about this is that they could not rush to the hospital because they needed to, as you said, to provide some help, some medications right there. And that by getting to the hospital would have taken too long. She would have died during the transportation. Any thoughts about this? Or is it just mistake and bad procedure?
I'm not sure if we could say either. It's what Gerald said. I was an emergency medical technician, an EMT. I worked on an ambulance for years when I was in college and law school. And it's just a different style of emergency medicine. And, I imagine there's probably countless examples where the French version actually saved the person's life versus the other way around, but you just don't hear about it because it wasn't anybody famous. In this case, because it were all these internal injuries that they had suffered, especially the princess, that wouldn't have been visible to the, I presume, paramedics, whatever they might have been, in the ambulance, and that if they had gotten her to the hospital facility, she might have been saved. I mean, obviously nobody, would ever know, but it's just a difference in the style of the two systems. I'm not sure that anything changed since then. I don't know if Gerald knows in how the French do their system.
I don't think it's changed as well. And Mark, very interesting. Leonardo, one of the things is there was a doctor who got there before the emergency crews, of course, Frederick Maillet, who I interviewed back then. He was a 36-year-old doctor who was near the scene of the accident, stopped his car, went over to the area, recognized only after he started to look in and try to reach in and see if he could help that it was in fact Diana, Princess of Wales. But he tried to provide some assistance, and then when the emergency crews arrived, he left. One of the things, you want to know what type of laissez-faire process had been set up for closing off the scene of the accident, was the fact that nobody took his name. Nobody came up to him from the investigative squad and said, by the way, you who were in the car over there, like with a stethoscope and listening to Diana, who are you? What are you doing? When he learned he wasn't sure it was her, but when it was confirmed the next day and he heard all the news, he called into the police, and they sort of sheepishly said to him, oh, thank you, we've been looking for you. Now, think for a second of a murder plot. Mark mentioned the Tomlinson plot, and he'll talk about that in more detail afterwards. But if you have a murder plot, you want to kill the Princess of Wales, and you decided to do it with a car accident, which is a fairly high-risk way of killing somebody because there's no sure bet they will die. Maybe you want to have, in a very sophisticated intelligence plot that Mohamed Al-Fayed imagined, you want to have what I call a safety valve. You want somebody to make sure that the death is successful. And that would be a passerby doctor, quote unquote, who assisted, was a good Samaritan, went to the accident scene, checked, and was providing help. That is the doctor who would give a lethal shot, give insulin, something that would kill the patient on the spot, so that later they would say, well, look at that, he should be given a medal for trying to help, but she was gone by the time the emergency crews arrived. And he would get away with it because nobody even had taken his name. So it goes to show, I think, not only the fact that if it was a murder plot, they banked just on the idea that the crash itself would kill her, which it might not have if the treatment to her had been faster. And the doctor who might have been the finisher was, in fact, just a good Samaritan.
Well, guys, but the NSA had something about Lady Diana, but they tried to conceal it. Can you guys explain what the NSA knew in advance and why they didn't want to disclose it?
But let me introduce that as to why that became relevant to the conspiracy. So there were two avenues that this conspiracy theory went down as to an actual murder. One was this man, Richard Tomlinson, who was former MI6, that's their British CIA. And Tomlinson had been imprisoned under the Official Secrets Act earlier that year for having gone public with a book that he had been fired by MI6. He was fighting it. He was publishing a book. It ultimately came out in like 2001 called The Big Breach. I'm sure it's on Amazon or eBay or something. And he had reached out to Al-Fayed at some point, probably before I came into the case, but I dealt with him directly. He had reported that when he was inside MI6, he became aware of a plot to kill Serbian president or Yugoslavian president Milosevic with going into cars in a tunnel and using, Gerald mentioned that a bright light might have distracted Henri Paul, using some sort of strobe light to cause the car to careen and crash. And so he wasn't saying he had evidence of the princess being killed that way, but that he knew of an operation that looked familiar or similar to how the princess died. And that maybe that was this British operation, right? That was one pathway of this conspiracy, intelligence agency conspiracy. The other one was that Al-Fayed his personnel. He had a lot of people don't realize that he owned a movie production company. Chariots of Fire, right? Academy Award winning film, 1981, I think it was one of his films. The movie Hook with Robin Williams about Peter Pan was one of his films. I think Dodi's name is actually on the film as a producer or something. He had a lawyer in California who was contacted by another American lawyer who said that he had a client who had evidence, documents of a British government plot to murder the princess, and that he would sell them for like $15-20 million. And this plot was brought up to the head of security for Harrods, who was my primary contact, a former Scotland Yard officer, since passed away as well. And they immediately did the right thing, and they went to the U.S. government with the information, and it became a sting operation with the U.S. government. And the documents, they were shown some of the, actually, I think I'm getting ahead of myself, did the sting operation, and they set it up to meet with the person in Vienna, which is one of the primary cities of spies historically. And an individual was arrested, a guy named Oswald Lewinter, former, well, I don't even want to say former, American. As soon as I heard that name, I knew exactly who it was, because this guy showed up in so many, he's passed away now too. He showed up in so many conspiracy theories over the years. Pan Am 103, which is another case that I have been very significantly involved with. I think he showed up at some point in the Kennedy assassination too. But he always claimed he was CIA, and he was in and out of jail. And it turned out that he was in jail with a double agent for the Czech Soviet government who had been caught because he had infiltrated the CIA in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was a huge swinger. He used to have these wild sex parties in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown. And he turned out to be a double agent. We caught him. He was imprisoned, and he was serving time in prison with Lewinter in like 1985. When they got a hold of the documents that Lewinter was trying to peddle, which ostensibly were going to show that the British government approached the American government for how to kill the princess, and the American government passed it on to the Israeli Mossad intelligence agency to help give them ideas or set it up. When the documents were retrieved and turned over to the CIA, and we eventually got copies of them, and that was one of my lawsuits, was to get access to these documents. There was a gasp by CIA officials at first because they looked real. And I'm sure at first people were like really concerned. And then someone realized, wait a second, the office title on the memo, on the letterhead, we don't call that office that name any longer. We changed that office name like a decade or so ago, because it turned out the double agent guy who Lewinter was working with, that the office was called, certain name when he was in the CIA. He created these fake documents, but he didn't realize the name of the office had changed. So they were clearly fake documents. Now, we sued the lawyer who was trying to broker the deal in a defamation case, if I recall. I'm trying to remember how we styled it because I was involved with this. And we used that as an opportunity to get access to all these other documents that the U.S. government had, including trying to get at the NSA documents. We got, for example, documents pertaining to Richard Tomlinson. I remember a box showing up at my office from the FBI. It was probably about a foot thick. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be something significant. It had like 2,000 pages of documents about Richard Tomlinson, because Tomlinson had tried to come to the United States to give a speech. I think he was going to show up on like NBC Today show, and they stopped him at the airport and we kicked him out of the country. And we were trying to find out why did that happen. They grabbed his internet provider, and there was all sorts of weird stuff going on between our government, the U.S. government, and the British government. Well, what was in these pages? This literally a foot high of boxes of pages, a box. I don't think there was anything more than maybe a date on a document. Every frickin' page was solid black. Solid black. I mean, the FBI must have printed out like 3 toner cartridges. And it was, I mean, as soon as I saw it, I laughed, because this was clearly the FBI screwing around with me just to send me a nice little message of, oh, here, you want all these files? Here you go. Here's 2,000 black pages with like nothing on it. It was, I still laugh. Even this is like 25 years later. The other aspect was these documents, or this tape that Gerald mentioned, of why does the NSA have these recordings of Diana? We never got those in the FOIA lawsuits because that's NSA's, bread and butter. That, surveillance of foreign officials. What it turned out to apparently be was, as Gerald described, that NSA were eavesdropping on, surveilling lawfully on the the Brazilian government, because there was a whole bunch of, I'm trying to remember, what was it? Environmental debates?
Though, Mark, I've never been convinced. I don't know. I can't say with certitude. I'm not so sure how legal that surveillance was. It's pretty unusual to have. I mean, think of it. It could be an international little flap. You have
National
Security Agency monitoring conversations at what is Brazil. It's the territory of the country, the embassy in Washington. It makes every other, I mean, even though countries feel as though the Americans might be listening through intelligence, to have that confirmed, that the wife of the ambassador is picked up in casual conversations with a good friend of hers, who's the Princess of Wales, and on things that have nothing to do with whatever the investigation would be, is rather extraordinary. And then they do what they always do, as you know so well, Mark. They don't turn it over. They fight you tooth and nail. They say that's our bread and butter, even if it's and it adds to the theory. And even what you said a moment ago, so amazing to me, because by the time that Fayed was contacted in '98 or that by that lawyer in LA. And even though those documents were fraudulent, the extent to which he wholeheartedly believed that his son was killed and it was only a matter of time to find it, he gave me a quote. If you don't mind me, I asked him about those documents, and he said, "I'm convinced these people were connected to the CIA. The documents they tried to sell me were fraudulent, but it is possible they were based on real documents that do exist." So he still thought somewhere in the CIA were the documents in which MI6 came in and said, "Help us kill Diana." And so it didn't dissuade him. I mean, I would think of myself being there and thinking, I can't believe I almost fell for that they were trying to shake me down for $15 million. For him, it was an effort. Yeah, they didn't have the goods, but they might know about something, and so they still exist somewhere. And he was really, in that way, never going to stop. It wasn't for him just something that he was saying. I was adamantly convinced that he believed in his heart
and
and
on
soul.
that, and you mentioned this earlier, because this is something I said all the time when I would be interviewed on this, that people didn't realize, because I've seen this in other tragedies that I've been involved with when I'm representing clients, especially from parents. He was emotionally destroyed and distraught I'm sure to the end of his life over the death of his son. As I recall, Dodi was his oldest son. He was his heir apparent. That's who he was really close to. Some of his other children were much, much younger that he had with other second wife, as I recall. So this really impacted him. And you add into this battle that he had with the British government and royal family for many years, as Gerald described. He was trying to become a British citizen. They kept denying him. He thought it was, anti-Arab bias, etc. And then I also do think I liked the guy. I mean, he treated me very well. I found him to be very friendly. I think the last time I saw him in person was around 2014, give or take. He was in his mid 80s, 84, 85, something like that. Very jovial, great sense of humor, just very friendly. But he was very emotional about this. And I also think a lot of people took advantage of him. And I think a lot of people put thoughts into his head, so that, we see it all the time. We see it in many conspiracy theories. You see it. I mean, look, the president of the United States now, Donald Trump, basically does whatever the last person who whispers in his ear told him to do, is what we usually say. And so I think there were a lot of factors that would go into it. I will tell you, Oswald Lewinter was a total scam artist.
Mhm.
That was his entire freaking life, as to what he was doing. He had no real CIA contacts that would know what was going on. And when you piece together the story with this, I don't know if the guy's still alive, and I'm totally blanking on his name, something with a K, as I recall, the guy who was a double agent for the Czech intelligence service inside the CIA. I mean, it made perfect sense. And then when we sued the lawyer, which ultimately resulted in some settlement, as I recall, I mean, it gave us a good opportunity for discovery to find out more about what happened. And there was, unfortunate for the lawyer, he just thought he was going to make a quick buck off of, trying to sell these documents, and he had no idea what they were or not.
And one thing, Leonardo, that when Mark's talking about the NSA documents in particular, Mohamed Fayed believed that one of the reasons that they put a murder plot into operation at the time they did is that Diana was pregnant. So
Yeah.
it wasn't just that Dodi was going to end up possibly marrying her. Even if it was just a fling, the Princess of Wales was pregnant with Fayed's grandchild. And once the British knew that, they moved to kill her. And the NSA tapes are important, not for anything to do with the murder, but because in these casual conversations, as I understand it, that go on for a little bit with Luisa Fletcher de Lima, who then described those conversations to me in an interview 2 years after the accident. They talked about dating. Diana talked about dating Dodi, and she was having fun. It was the first time she was really like in this situation, and she was enjoying it. He was lavishing all types of gifts on her, but she wasn't pregnant. Never mentioned to Louisa Fletcher de Lima, who was her close friend. And I do know the British, though, were concerned about it, because one of the things I uncovered in my own reporting was that during the autopsy, a telephone call came in from the Home Secretary's office that said anything about pregnancy. They had not yet determined that, and said, leave it out of the autopsy, whatever's found. That's pretty remarkable. That means that the British were worried at some level of government that maybe, in fact, the rumors were right and she was pregnant, and they didn't want that in an autopsy report. It turns out that, when the Paget report, which is the official British, the Warren Commission report of the Brits, came out, she was not, in fact, pregnant, although people who don't believe reports from official government agencies, especially when they come out, years and years after the event, are unlikely to believe that. I do not believe she was pregnant.
My recollection was there was some theory that something might have given a false positive reading in the autopsy, or secondly, her body was embalmed, right? As I recall, which I think was against French law. But the conspiracy theory, of course, became the Brits did that. Maybe this was what it was. The Brits did that so that it would mask any pregnancy test once the body came back to England, because the formaldehyde or whatever was used for embalming would cover it up, or false positive it, or just blank it out. That was the conspiracy theory. I'm not saying that was our theory or my theory, but that was what was out there.
It's very interesting, Mark. I don't know how you feel about this, but let's assume for a second she was pregnant, that the test had been positive. They were able to confirm that. It still wouldn't change my view of the fact that this was a tragic accident. It would add more impetus and meaning and motive to the Fayeds of the world in that, but right. It wouldn't change my conclusion about the case. But people think that sometimes they look at that as though that's the turning point. Oh, she wasn't pregnant, so it's unlikely they were going to kill her. Oh, she was pregnant, they were going to kill her. And I just don't see that as the factor, but I do understand why people are so focused on that.
Right. It's sort of like, well, the only evidence of Oswald's view of Kennedy was actually positive, according to Marina Oswald. So then if it was positive, why would he kill him?
Right.
Oh, yes, positive. Absolutely. Because people don't get that even if you have videos or you don't, or pregnant ladies or not pregnant ladies, car accidents have the same dynamic. It's the same thing that I hear all the time about 9/11 or other cases, that they come up with these things that lead nowhere, and they think that this is the wedge to contradict the official version. Well, you mentioned the Operation Paget, or whatever is the right pronunciation in English. And what big mistakes are still there in that big report?
And I'll start it, and then I'll let Gerald answer specifically if he followed up on it. When I was involved from 2000 to 2003, in the aftermath of Gerald's article, which was very much my guide for things, because Gerald identified so many legitimate questions. It wasn't necessarily that he was answering it. All these questions that really needed to be answered by the government, whether the French government or the British government. And as so often is the case, the governments contributed to the conspiracy theories by not being transparent. The British refused to do an official investigation because they said the French are doing it. And the French secrecy laws would never, as Gerald mentioned, the French investigation's never been released. Who knows what might be in there, even to answer questions legitimately to show that this was nothing more than an accident. But that secrecy contributed to everything. Finally, with all the litigation we were doing in the United States, which was helping keep the case alive. I mean, I saw that as very much my real role was to keep the questions out there, to keep the interest up, because then eventually the British agreed to do this official investigation in which most, if not all, but most, probably not all, of the questions Gerald had raised were addressed, at least in one form or fashion or another. You might not agree with it, right? You might not like Arlen Specter's single bullet theory, but it's an explanation, and you can either accept it or reject it. So this official investigation, I think, answered most of my questions that were really burning. Doesn't answer all of them. And I'll let Gerald go into any details that he can remember about the
No, I
investigation.
think you're actually right. I mean, two detectives came over from Scotland Yard, interviewed me in Miami for all the information that I had. I provided my notes, but material interviews that I had had that became later part of the Padgett report. The Padgett report was late. That's part of the problem, as Mark said. They didn't do it for a long time. It did answer the questions that the British could answer. The problem is the French. I hate to throw one country under the bus here. They just haven't cooperated. They refuse to give material over to the Brits. They haven't turned over the scientific and medical evidence of the autopsy. We have just scattered about it. Haven't provided the doctors or the medical examiners for any type of sworn testimony, much less even interviews before the British investigators. They haven't provided the police files. And I do report, by the way, in the article that the police who investigated the crime initially had some disdain for even being assigned to it because they thought of it as a glorified high-profile traffic accident, and it was somehow demeaning to the detectives who were put on the case. One of them at one point in front of a journalist who went in and had spit, maybe just to make a point, at a Union Jack that was nearby, a symbol of it. And no love was lost here. And so the police didn't like the idea that they were doing what they thought was a glorified traffic accident. And then the French later, when the questions came up in subsequent years about the mistakes they may have made, instead of being forthcoming or transparent, they just decided to hold back. And they didn't even cooperate with it. So I think that if there's information there, I'd love to know more about the Fiat Uno files that the French police have. I'd love to see the medical files inside the hospital. I'd like to have the testimony, if it was taken by investigators, from the emergency workers who arrived at the scene. There are a number of things that would be on my wish list, but they're all in French custody.
Any idea why the French report was never published?
Well, I mean, why should it be? There are only a couple of people like Mark, me, and a few others asking for it, and a few Brits. They've been able to hold it back and not withstand any great scrutiny.
So, you know, the one, this is who I'll mention this guy's name now. See, Gerald, you can say if you know anything further. So the guy I was mentioning or referring to, James Andenson, he was a photographer, and he was a paparazzi, and he owned a white Fiat Uno, the same make and color. I'm reading from an article as I'm looking it up online. And he was found dead 2.5 years later. I want to say probably like either the end of 99 or beginning of 2000. And it was just a weird coincidence or something more. As I said, his studio had been broken into. A lot of his photographs had been stolen. It was a very weird situation. Of course, again, we can liken it to the Kennedy assassination, all these mysterious deaths that have happened over the years, some of which are mysterious for sure, some of which are not suspicious at all, but for the fact that the person died at some point in time. But it is, if anything is out there that I'd like to know more about, would be that guy, to understand what happened to him. But it doesn't mean he had anything to do with the.
No, you're right. And there, Mark, and I had to make sure. So he was a French photojournalist, even though his name doesn't sound French, right? And he died in France. So again,
May of 2000, they found him dead in his car, on fire.
So the crime scene, if it's a crime scene, the scene of the accident, as with Dodi, as with Diana, as with the accident that killed the Princess of Wales, it's all in France. That's where the custody is of these cases. That's where the investigations are. So, you know, if there are loose ends, we have to see those files. And what I'm most interested in is not interviewing somebody who was the assistant police detective on the case 30 years ago. I'm interested in the contemporaneous files, when the memories were fresh, what they were doing, what the notes were, the notations, the calls back and forth, to the extent that those have been maintained. That would be fascinating. Maybe there's nothing that will answer a lot of questions for us, but it would be, for history and researchers and investigators, the only critical material we could still access.
You know, I'll say this, because Gerald and I talk all the time, and, and particularly about the Kennedy assassination, and we are on the verge of when is it? I think as we're taping this, I think this tomorrow is the next congressional hearing on the
Or
Kennedy case,
it was
right?
just yeah the
Did I miss it already?
yeah, it was yesterday.
Oh, there you go. Not even that's how much I'm even paying attention. But the point of it is there is still so-called, air quote, new evidence that keeps coming out on the Kennedy assassination, new documents, witnesses coming forward, whether fake or real or, whatever it might be, credible, unreliable. I will say, I cannot think of really anything of consequence that has come out on Princess Diana's death in the last 20 years since
Yeah.
the Paget report.
No,
Nothing.
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely
Right?
you're absolutely right. Yeah,
No major witness, at least not that's gotten press here in the United States. And every once in a while, I get asked to do an interview like this. Some television show will do, History Channel, whatever, will do something, and it's all just talking about what we did back then, what we knew from then. No witnesses come. Maybe there's some obscure, Le Monde article that I don't know of or something like that. But no new witnesses have come forward. No new document has surfaced. It just has moved on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would have expected for a while. Well, Mohamed Fayed died when?
Well, just like last year.
Okay,
Yeah, a
so I
couple
would have
years ago.
okay. So I would have thought, because Mark had said earlier that he was taken advantage of by people, and I would have thought that scammers or people wanted to come up with a story or be a new witness or whatever else would have thought of him as sort of an open cash machine, like an ATM, and would have tried to approach. Now, he did have good people around him with McNamara and others who had been at Scotland Yard, so they would weed out a lot of the fakes. There's no doubt. But it is interesting that more people didn't try over time. Maybe got a reputation for not being an easy touch as the years went on. But that would have encouraged, you would think, some wild stories.
Yeah, he died in 2023, almost 2 years ago, August 30th, and the princess, of course, died August 31st. So I don't know if that's a coincidence or a conspiracy theory for it. But yeah, I mean, and Mohammed was, sorry, look, I mean, he was 93, 4 years old or something like that. But yeah, and John McNamara, that's who my primary liaison was. He was the head of security for Fayed, former Scotland Yard. John died a bunch, I don't know, like a decade ago or something like that. And I'm not sure how long he stayed with Fayed. They were still he was still in contact when I saw him in 2014, because that's who I went through to say hi when I was visiting London. But they weren't pushing anything that I'm aware of. You really didn't hear them still focusing on it. I think once the British investigation finished and the information came out, they pretty much quieted down
I agree.
from that for whatever reason.
Well, guys, I think that we covered all the relevant aspects about this case. So I think that whoever is watching this video by now should know that royals and normal people die in car accidents exactly the same way. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that there was foul play in this case. And that was just a tragic happenstance. And things like this, unfortunately, every once in a while happen. I thank you guys again for your time and for your very precious explanations from the very unique angle that the both of you can provide, since you were deeply involved in this case. So thank you again for your time, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leonardo.
Thanks everybody else for watching this episode, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.